Hello and welcome to South2North. Throughout history and across the world, human beings have perpetrated mass atrocities against one another. Some countries have their own justice systems to deal with these atrocities. But when the rule of law breaks down or war renders laws ineffective, who steps in to right the wrongs committed by the perpetrators? And who should be held accountable? And by what body of justice? Today on the show, I have Reed Brody, counsel for Human Rights Watch in New York, and Yasmin Sooka, Executive Director of the Foundation for Human Rights. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with you, Mr. Reed. The New York Times has called you the bounty hunter for human justice. Why?
Well, for the last 15 years, I've been working alongside atrocity victims who are trying to bring to justice the people responsible for those atrocities. In 1998, when the Chilean former dictator Augusto Pinochet was arrested in England on a warrant from a Spanish judge for crimes committed in Chile, I went to London to help work on the case. And when the British House of Lords upheld Pinochet's arrest, we realized that we had a new tool in international justice to bring to book tyrants and torturers who had seemingly made themselves immune from justice. And human rights groups and victims around the world who, like us, were inspired by the Pinochet case, contacted us to take on their cases. And I took on a number of cases. Some have gone forward, most haven't. One case where I've been working alongside the victims for 14 years, the case of the former dictator of Chad, Habré, who is accused of thousands of political killings, of systematic torture in the 1980s. Just last month, 25 years after his rule, a Senegalese special court indicted him for crimes against humanity and placed him in detention.
I understand that you've got a picture on a wall in your office. Who are those people in that picture?
Well, it's a map of the world with something I put together with colleagues from Human Rights Watch. And it's a graphic illustration of the different people around the world who have a case to answer for torture or for war crimes. So there are people there like Mengistu Haile Mariam of Ethiopia, whose government killed thousands of opponents, whose forced relocation policies probably led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people from malnutrition. And Mengistu has been living in Zimbabwe since 1991. There are people on the map like Ben Ali of Tunisia, who now lives in Saudi Arabia, or Raul Cedras from Haiti, who's in Panama. But it's not just third world dictators on the map. There's a picture on the map of George W. Bush. Human Rights Watch has called for a case to be opened against George Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, George Tenet, for the waterboarding of detainees, for the disappearance of detainees into secret prisons, for secretly sending suspects for interrogation to places like Gaddafi's Libya, Mubarak's Egypt, and even Assad's Syria, where they were tortured under interrogation. So it's really a map that shows who out there has a case to answer for torture and war crimes.
Behind every search for justice, there are people like yourself who pursue these cases. What makes you do what you do?
I guess I've seen the debilitating effect of impunity, of lack of accountability. In a country like Haiti, where I've worked a lot, the fact that a small elite has gotten away with plunder and murder for generations has left people, the poor majority, feeling like they have no rights, like they don't exist. And, you know, we used to have a saying that if you kill one person, you go to jail. You kill 10 people, they put you in an insane asylum. You kill 10,000 people, you get invited to a peace conference. And I think we need to change that. I guess on a personal level, it's just a great privilege for me to work with victims, with family members who have harnessed their suffering into a quest for justice. People like Suleiman Gengeng in Chad, who from the depths of his prison cell, as people were dying around him, took an oath that if he ever got out, he would fight for justice. People like Bobby Duval in Haiti, who counted 180 people who died in his little cell in Fort Dimanche. And Bobby now runs school programs for kids, and he says that part of his mission in life is to make sure that the youth in Haiti remember what happened under Duvalier. So it's both for idealistic reasons and for personal reasons, I think, that I've been working with these victims.
Yasmin Sooka, let's bring you in here. You have sat on several Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, Sierra Leone, South Africa. What makes you do what you do?
I think the victims, and a real sense that if they can find the courage to survive and to tell their stories, then we as human rights activists need to make sure that in the end they're able to access justice.
And does telling the story equal justice for the victim?
I don't think so. I think it's the start of a process. But it's a very important part of the process, because it's not enough for the victim or for a few people to know, but you actually need the rest of the world to know who the people are who did it. And I think that's the beginning of the process. The second, I think, is to try and look at what you can do, and using different tools, truth commissions, international justice, I think are all part of the process.
Reed mentioned some very prominent dictators. How difficult is it to bring such powerful people to justice?
Very, very difficult. You know, I've just spent the last 4 years working on the final phases of the war in Sri Lanka. I've come off a commission where we've made a number of recommendations to the Human Rights Council. We know who the perpetrators are, but we cannot get the political establishment in the world to agree on a process on how to deal with them, because they still are in power. And so all of us, we communicate with each other around the world, and we wait for them to come into countries where we perhaps can use the domestic process to arrest them. And so these are the tools we grapple with. But we know for every 10 of them out there, we're lucky if we're able to indict one of them in a 10-year period and find that they are actually convicted.
You've heard some horrific testimonies. How do you cope with that?
I think by speaking to other people who are working with me on the issues, and really, in a sense, you deflecting the pain away from you. But, what's always humbling about the process is the fact that the victims find the courage to go on. And that always helps you to, in a sense, share the burden.
You're nodding there, Reed. Can you share how you cope with some of the horrific stories and atrocities that you hear?
Well, I agree with Yasmin. I think that, it's the courage and the tenacity of the victims that make this worthwhile. I've met victims who give up, who their life is over and they've given up. And then you meet other people who take that and say that they're not going to stay victims, that they're going to transform themselves into activists, and that's what is inspiring.
Now, Reed, tell us about 3 prominent dictators. You've been working on these cases. Mont of Guatemala, you've mentioned Baby Doc of Haiti, and we're also talking about Hissène Habré of Chad. What do these dictators have in common?
Well, a lot. The first thing they have in common is actually that they are all US-backed dictators from the 1980s who are finally, 25, 30 years later, facing justice for crimes against humanity. These were all dictators supported by Ronald Reagan in the context of the Cold War. I mean, in the case of Rios Montt in Guatemala, the Ixil Mayan Indians over 3 decades pressed the case, and this in a country where just asking for justice gets you killed, or can. They have pressed the case forward until finally the political conditions were there and in particular, very brave Attorney General Claudia Paz y Paz, the case was able to move forward. These aren't cases that have come down from an international court in The Hague. The victims themselves have put together the prosecution and have taken ownership.
Why is Habré being tried in local Senegalese courts?
We believe that if this idea of international justice was really going to be international, then it couldn't just be the Englands and the Spains of the world that took on these cases, but also countries of the global south had to step up. And Hissène Habré was in Senegal. And so we helped the victims from Chad file the case in Senegal. And 14 years later, after many twists and turns, that's where the case is going to be tried. But it took a lot to get there. Habré was first indicted by a Senegalese court in 2000 on charges of crimes against humanity and torture. But then the president of Senegal, President Wade, said he's not going to be tried in Senegal. We helped the victims then file a case in Belgium, which had a long-arm universal jurisdiction law. The Belgian courts investigated the case for 4 years, requested Habré's extradition. President Wade said, I'm not going to send them to Belgium. Senegal asked the African Union what to do. And the African Union wisely said to Senegal, well, you have an obligation to prosecute Habré, and we want you to do that in the name of Africa. This was 2006. President Wade said he would do it, but didn't. The new president of Senegal, Macky Sall, when he got elected, said, we're going to prosecute Habré in the name of Africa. And Senegal and the African Union got together and created a special court within the Senegalese justice system, but with judges appointed by the African Union to carry out the prosecution of Hissène Habré.
You are particularly passionate, I can see that, Reed, about the Habré case. What is your role in all of this, in collecting evidence? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, really 90% of the work in this case and in the other cases is really just to get to a court, to do the campaigning, to make the victims' voices heard, to go to the halls of power, just to get the idea that there should be a trial. We've worked with the African Union, with the United Nations, with the governments of Senegal. And so most of the struggle of the victims in any of these cases is just to get their case heard before a court. In the Habré case, we've also, and in some other cases, we've also been involved in actually putting the case together. We've interviewed hundreds of witnesses. We were very lucky. I happened to stumble on the files of Hissène Habré's political police in an abandoned building in N'Djamena, the capital of Chad. And there we have tens of thousands of documents that provide a roadmap to the repression of the Chadian people. All these documents are now on CD-ROM. And they're the names, just in these documents, of 1,208 people who were killed or who died in detention, of over 12,000 victims of different kinds of abuses. We've interviewed people who wish to work with Hissène Habré, because when you're pursuing a head of state, it's not just the victim's testimony who can talk about what they suffered. You need to make the link up to the head of state. And so the documents make that link, but you also have people around Hissène Habré who can talk about what he did.
So, Yasmin, how do we decide which institutions and methods to use to get this justice? Habré is being tried in the Senegalese court, Uhuru Kenyatta's trial coming up at the ICC.
I think initially in terms of the discussions held between Kenya and, of course, the ICC, there was some discussion that parts of the trial take place in Kenya. But of course, recently in a submission made by the ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, she's actually saying that it's not the role of the trial chamber to decide where this trial should take place. The African Union, of course, has also approached the ICC about using Article 16 to stay the prosecution, the indictment really, because they are arguing that to have the president and the vice president indicted really creates an emergency for Kenya. I think we're going to have to follow in the next few months, but already in the last week, a number of the witnesses have been flown to The Hague because there's a real sense that perhaps in Kenya, with the leadership of Kenya being indicted, there is a great possibility that witnesses will be compromised. So I think we're going to have to look at all of these cases on an individual basis. But what's really important, I think, is for African governments to begin to assert that they too have signed on to international justice and they're willing to uphold the rule of law.
And speaking of African governments, the African Union is not always happy with the International Criminal Court. They're arguing that there is a disproportionate prosecution and focus of African violators or dictators. What's your take on that?
I think that's certainly true, but we must also remember that a number of the cases that went to the ICC were in fact referred there by African governments who've really also tried to use the ICC as a tool for dealing with their own political opponents. But on the other hand, you know, one of the things which would really break that kind of allegation is if we saw George W. Bush or Donald Rumsfeld in front of the ICC, or if we saw the former British Prime Minister being indicted for what happened in the countries all of them went into, because what it does create is a sense of inequality, and the fact that that inequality manifests itself at the international political level. And of course, you have the US supporting a lot of these cases from behind, but they haven't actually signed up to the Rome Convention. And so that always creates a problem when you have this discussion with African leaders. And many, in fact, are beginning to argue that they want to have nothing to do with the ICC. But if you consider that they were amongst the first countries to ratify the Rome Statute, it would really be a poor showing if we didn't build more confidence in the ICC.
I suppose it is difficult for them to have confidence when the US, Western governments, some Western governments, not signatories to the ICC. But Reed, isn't this a problem? The fact that the United States is not a signatory to the ICC, are we likely to see a US president being tried by any international body or court?
I think it is a problem for the system of international justice. I mean, not just the United States, but I mean, is it likely that Russian leaders will be brought to book for crimes in Chechnya, or Chinese leaders? These countries have effectively immunized themselves from international justice, or from the ICC at least, by refusing to sign on, as Yasmin said, to the Rome Statute, setting up the ICC. And of course, countries that aren't members of the ICC can their leaders can only be brought before the International Criminal Court if there's a Security Council vote. In the United States, Russia, China, UK have vetoes on the Security Council. And it's not just the ICC that is undermined by this. Under the Pinochet precedent, people can go to the courts of other countries. The Habré case was filed in Belgium. The Pinochet case was filed in Spain. But what we see is that when victims from Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and elsewhere have gone to the courts in Europe, the cases have been thrown out by European courts on political grounds. Well-founded cases against Donald Rumsfeld for the mistreatment of prisoners were filed in France and in Germany, were thrown out for political reasons. The one case that's alive for Guantanamo was in Spain, where it was being handled by Judge Baltasar Garzón, who was hounded out of the judiciary. And thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that the Obama administration is not only refusing to prosecute the crimes against detainees committed in the previous government of George Bush, but has lobbied Spain actively to throw out these cases. So we do see an inequity. Now, obviously, it's not a reason not to seek justice. As Desmond Tutu said, referring to the indictment of Omar el-Bashir in Sudan, justice is in the interest of the victims, and the victims of these cases are African victims. And I can assure you that the victims of Hiss and Habré are thrilled that the case is going forward, and don't say, well, until we get George Bush, we shouldn't work on this case. But it does create a double standard, and it does create a very easy answer for the cynical defenders of those who perpetrate crimes. And it does undermine or threaten to undermine the architecture of international justice.
Let's talk about truth. Do we only investigate or even pursue the truth for purposes of prosecution?
No. I think that, you know, the notion of the right to the truth is a highly developed norm under international law. And we talk about the right to the truth in two contexts. The one is the right of the victims to know about what has happened to loved ones. But on the other hand, it's also about a right that societies have to understand how it was possible that these things happened. We don't do that to build, in a sense, a better understanding of the truth, but really to understand what kind of processes we need to put in place to ensure that these things never happen again. So it's not just about prosecutions. In some instances, it's also about allowing a society to come to terms with the past.
Any comment on that, Reed, the place of the truth? Is it sometimes enough to just know the truth?
Well, I think that after now 2 decades of experience in transitional justice, we see that there's a panoply of measures that should be taken together. Truth without anything else can be just words. Prosecution without these larger measures can look like revenge. Compensation without anything else can look like blood money. So in the best transitions, you have a kind of a holistic measures, but prosecution is a very important element. 30 years ago, it was not possible. Today, in virtually every transition, even if it doesn't always end up that way, at least criminal justice is always on the table.
So, Reed, we've got these institutions globally that are meant to bring justice to those who have been violated. But why do we still see so many atrocities in this day and age?
Well, I don't think we can expect that the justice system is going to solve all the problems. You know, when General Pinochet was arrested, we said that it was his arrest and the House of Lords decision was a wake-up call for dictators. Maybe it was, but what I think it really was a source of inspiration for victims around the world. And I think the one thing we are seeing today is that all over the world, human rights activists, victims realize that they have the possibility, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but of bringing people to justice. And we're not going to, there are so many reasons why atrocities are being committed today. But I think that what we're doing is we're leveling the playing field. We're putting tools in the hands of civil society to say enough is enough. So it's not the justice system that is going to solve all the world's problems, I think.
And Yasmin, I know you're heading off to Kenya. What's on your agenda?
Well, it's really about beginning a discussion with the African Union around a transitional justice policy framework for Africa. And of course, on that agenda is the question of the International Criminal Court and the stance that the African Union has taken. And so one of the things we want to explore is if the African governments don't want their perpetrators to be taken to The Hague, then what kind of institutional frameworks are they willing to set up? And how seriously are they going to take the issue of combating impunity? And so we're going to explore whether or not the African court can be strengthened, how we can use the question of regional courts in the region. And of course, we've had the example of the SADC court being shut down by Zimbabwe. And so it's an important issue. So it's really beginning to challenge African governments. If you're saying that the West is a double standard, then how are you going to ensure that you deal with atrocities in your own backyard?
So, Reed, who's next to be hunted by the bounty hunter for human justice?
If a case were opened against George Bush for torture and mistreatment of detainees, I think international justice would skyrocket around the world. I think there are many cases out there, and it'll be to victims and human rights groups around the world to take up the Habré precedent as we took up the Pinochet precedent.
Well, that's certainly a huge challenge for us as citizens of the world, and for us to decide what sort of world we want for ourselves and for our children. Yasmin Sooka, thank you very much for your time today. And Reed Brody, a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you very much for joining us on South2North.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Please tweet your questions, comments, and opinions to @AJSouth2North or find us on Facebook. Do join me again next time on South2North. Until then, goodbye.